Good morning. Brilliant talk by Paul, and he's going to resonate, well, his ideas I'm going to resonate about mobile. There's two things I really want to communicate this morning. One is we should and need to be ambitious. I think it's great to have a billion-dollar vision from day one. I think it's the only way that you can really go out there and change something. And I think to many of Paul's points, which I'll kind of reiterate, which are just superbly important, is mobile. I'm going to rant about how that is where all the opportunities are for all of us. And I don't want to be on that kind of level which says, Europe and the UK can be as good as the States. But frankly, I'm going to reference a lot of stuff that we've done at Hailo that has really taken us on that path. And then I'll also end with why I'm actually leaving Hailo at potentially one of the most interesting points of its history and development to go on and do something that I'm going to term slightly more interesting. So forgive my use of some of these animations, but it's kind of fun. 10 startups have exited for more than $1 billion in the last 5 years, which is quite interesting. The really interesting fact about that is 8 of them were in 2011 and 2012. There is definite momentum going on about the technology, social adoption, all the different factors that are enabling this to happen faster and more recently. None of this is a coincidence. The interesting bit is there have been 2 apps that have fallen into that world. And we can all agree or disagree about whether Instagram was a viable acquisition for $1 billion, but a couple of years down the line, or not quite a couple of years down the line, Facebook is reaping some ridiculous rewards out of that acquisition. So there are very few people out there right now saying that they overpaid. Interestingly, Waze, for those of you who don't know what Waze is an interesting Israeli startup that I'll go into a little bit more detail, but is fundamentally focused on mapping, but also social. Also had pretty much 0 revenues when it was acquired for $1 billion by Google. So we're onto something here. Outside of these 2 companies, the rest were really billion-dollar IPOs. But I'm going to venture to guess that actually the new acquisitions and the new opportunities are actually going to be entirely in the mobile space. I've got 0 doubt that this is the best opportunity. We'll go through some of the metrics behind a number of these app companies. And it's completely and utterly feasible that small teams here today, if you kind of follow the golden rules of what a lot of these guys have done, can quite easily in 2 or 3 years turn around a ridiculous sized company like one of them. What I want to do is sort of set the scene, and then with a few more numbers, I'm going to focus a little bit more on numbers here because I want people to really believe that these opportunities are here now and really for the taking. We've only got 1 billion people using smartphones today, right now. There's 6 billion feature phones out there, and with prices going down, clearly, there's a lot more people that are going to be using these apps and technologies. And we have a look at some of the apps that are actually really taking advantage of that as well. Secondarily, combined with the devices. In terms of internet access, there are plenty of countries out there that have got very little fixed internet access, and where people's first experience of the internet, again, to reiterate Paul's point, is going to be on a mobile device via mobile internet. So let's remember that. But at the same time, let's remember that there's almost 1 million apps out there. There's a hell of a lot of noise. So the bar for what you need to do is incredibly high. The bit that I love is this. I didn't really fully appreciate how much more time people were spending on apps. And I have to say apps in many senses are super clunky, right? It's a limited pile of functionality and features in a little wrapper that really seems disjoint from everything else. Once we get to the world of apps interrelating and interworking with other apps is going to be very interesting. But the bit that we are definitely seeing is mobile web is certainly not growing anywhere near as fast. Or anyway, so the focus is apps. Here's a spectacular slide, and if some of these seem familiar, I have ripped off Business Insider, so I'll openly say that. But they've got some really interesting data up here, which is, this is US-centric mobile data. Even in the US, if you look at the numbers down there, you can see that only 40-odd% of people have ever even played a game. on their smartphone. That's a hell of a lot more people still to support a few more billion-dollar startups in that kind of space. So we don't even have to rely on the audience of the developing nations in order to create some huge opportunities. What I really wanted to outline is these five apps I can't count, these 7 apps, and this one too. We're on the way, we're not quite there, but the 7 on top have all got very clear, justified billion-dollar valuations right now, with Flipboard being the recent addition. As of yesterday, they just raised around at an 800 million valuation, but are doing some really good stuff. Why are these companies so interesting? What have they done? We'll get to that in 1 second. Let's have a look first at the criteria of what it means to join the billion-dollar club. So out of a handful of companies we talked about before, the 9 or 10 that have made it to this level, the average age, the average time span that they've had to be incubated to get to a billion-dollar valuation, IPO or acquisition, is 7 years. That is going down very, very quickly. The range is 2 years for Instagram and 10 years for Pandora. So we can clearly see that this whole trend is accelerating. The bit that's really exciting, and why I think it's fantastic for this audience here, is that the differentiators in these companies are both the last point there and the second point, which is a huge focus on end user value and a founder, and it has to really be the founder and the founding team who has a completely disproportionate view on how important the product is. If that product is not simple, if it doesn't do something different and fantastic, it obviously won't cut through the noise of 800,000 apps, soon to be 1 million. The one that's interesting and completely debatable is about creating a new category or a subcategory. And this can come in 1 million different flavors. It can be accidental, it could be otherwise, but we'll look at some very concrete examples about that. But let's look at these guys again. What have these guys done? Uber came about a year and a half before Hailo. And these guys are focusing on a very, very different market. Why have they justified a $3.5 billion valuation? And why did Google and one other private equity company throw in $258 million for these guys when their last round was only about $40, $50 million? Uber's done something absolutely amazing. They've created a model that is fundamentally profitable. They can roll out new cities, and those cities make money straight away. They can launch a city with 25 cars. They're not dependent on taxi drivers like Hailo are. They use taxi drivers as well, but they start off with black cars in every new city. They have an incredible team and a maniacal CEO who has a vision to take over the world. And frankly, he's doing it. And that's a good thing. Second, WhatsApp is a whole different category. These guys started out by saying, after a lifetime at Yahoo, we hate advertising. Advertising is the bane of our existence. Again, because it isn't particularly personalized yet, and it isn't particularly relevant. So they started off with a business model that they've now very much pivoted on and changed. Previously, it was pay the 99 cents for a download, and they've managed to get 250 million odd downloads of their app. It worked beautifully on iOS. It never worked on Android in terms of monetization. Android users just wouldn't pay for it. But nevertheless, until very recently, the last couple months, where they've now made the download free and you pay $1 a year subscription, it worked incredibly. And for a 40-person company to turn down billion-dollar acquisition offer, at least one verified from Google, that's pretty impressive. And they've only taken one funding round from Sequoia for $8 million, more for strategic reasons and probably just to put a bit of cash in the bank. But they didn't need to do it, and they didn't particularly want to do it. Square, we've kind of talked about, and I'll go through some opportunities in terms of payments, but undoubtedly the mix between hardware and mobile, everyone kind of laughed at him. Visa and MasterCard, laughed at Mr. Dorsey and said, your crummy little piece of plastic's not going to do much. They're processing the same amount of payments as PayPal Mobile now, 15 billion a year. Angry Birds is a great story, won't go into it again, everyone's heard about it, it's absolutely amazing, but an app that's got 1 billion downloads is pretty impressive. Snapchat, again, reinvented a category. 2 guys at Stanford, they dropped out, they were working in one of their dad's living room. They hit a trend, they hit a vein, they understood their users, and they're still only 25, 30 people, and you may not think that they're worth 800 million, which is what they just raised their valuation of. But I'll tell you, the behavioral change and the growth would suggest otherwise. And again, they've just announced recently they're up to 350 million photos or snaps per day. They are now at the point in the next sort of couple months where they're going to be rivaling Facebook's volume of interaction and photo uploading. So that's pretty scary for a Facebook. So if you want to see another Instagram acquisition, it's coming along. Cut the Rope is another beautiful one. About 250, 300 million downloads as well. Again, another version of brilliant gamers, kind of like the Rovio guys, two Russian brothers who from age 10 have been programming games. So it just goes to tell you how long it takes to actually create a hit. It is quite complicated. And then Flipboard, again, aggregation, completely reinventing the way that we consume news by taking a bet on one device. It all started on an iPad. There was no website. The web component only just came out 2 or 3 months ago. It's amazing that you can build this value by having, again, a maniacal vision. So let's have a little look at Waze and what they've actually done. So 7 years old, 80 employees, 67 million in funding. So why $1 billion for these guys? The really interesting bit is they may have been around for quite a while, but the momentum has only been in the last couple of years in terms of social and the social mobile aspect for them. Google has been notoriously, let's say, challenged at being able to do the kind of personal thing. These guys, in the matter of a year and a half, have exploded from 12 to 50 million active users, right? And there is such a natural fit, but they're also one of the very, very few companies, being Israeli and all, these guys go straight to the core of technology, where they've built the maps, they've built the data, they've built out something like 15 cities in massive, massive detail that, again, can go in there and append these mapping products. And of course, there was a defensive strategy there. It's always nice when someone else is bidding for you, like Facebook. But more importantly, if you have a look at the actual financials of the deal, out of that 80-odd people that are in the company, a huge number of those are engineers. They've all been retained for 4 years. When you start looking at acqui-hire numbers and acqui-hire valuations in terms of retaining engineers for a 4-year period, Google's paying in the 1 to 2 to 3 million range per engineer for that kind of acquisition. So in many senses, it already makes sense on the surface for a company that even wasn't making revenue, or very little. So now let's have a look at opportunities. I want to talk about new things that are actually coming right now and sort of weave in some of the Hailo stuff. 150 times a day is how often we play, on average, with our smartphone. I can't believe that number, but I've seen it now in a number of independent and verified studies. We pull out our phones 150 times a day. At the very top level, in terms of the apps that we interact with, 43% of that time is games. I mean, that's kind of hilarious. And if I were Nintendo, I'd be severely depressed. But the other bit, 26% social networking, 10% entertainment, 10% utilities, 11% some other stuff that we're doing on there as well. The 10% utilities and the other is really where all the e-commerce fits in, which is fantastically interesting. The fact that so little of our attention generates so much money and so much opportunity is fascinating. But here's the really kind of hardcore breakdown, which is interesting. And where if you haven't sort of seen this information before, I'd definitely kind of get your hands on it. Because in terms of creating a new opportunity, this is how many times a day we do each one of these things on a smartphone. And you can see where the opportunity lies. You can see why startups are targeting different activities. Messaging, voice calls, clearly way up there at the very, very top. Music player, gaming, social media, alarm, camera, news, calendar search, etc. And miscellaneous is interestingly where a lot of the e-commerce falls as well. But what's missing? Right now I can tell you, from that stuff, we've got 1 billion people right now doing these 3 things, or these 3 apps every day. No one's cracked them. No one's cracked the calendar app. Everyone's tried. It is really, really hard. But that one, overnight, you do a social calendar app, $1 billion company. You do a clock that somehow goes social, reads the news to you, makes you buy something when you wake up, and an alarm that maybe tells you when your friends are waking up, or an alarm that tells you where you are when you're waking up. These things are social. They're $1 billion opportunities just from the usage. You don't even have to make money. Just get people to use it. So right there, just from that data, There are 3 things right there. Trust me, I've been racking my head over these things for months, trying to figure out what the hell we can build on these ones, because they're just waiting there to be plucked, and they're the really obvious ones. But the bit that I really want to kind of talk about is the commerce sector and e-commerce on mobile, because it's crazy. People just love buying shit. It's fantastic. And I'll go into a really interesting example, because I had a great conversation in Palo Alto a few weeks ago with some very, very interesting people. So mobile is still a sliver, but it's growing quite nicely in terms of all of e-commerce sales. But here's the bit that's really, really fun. 20% of e-commerce now is being driven by mobile. And if you start looking at where those curves are going, and some really interesting examples, you'll see there's a huge opportunity there. Payments is a huge, fantastical area as well. Every transaction that happens here is got to go through some kind of payment provider. And there's some new guys. PayPal's finally fixed up their act, which is absolutely amazing. And trust me, they're going to be quite formidable in the next couple of years. We've dealt with them quite closely at Hailo, and they were very, very slow off the bat, but they're ramping like crazy. But these guys, it's only a sliver, but you can see it's growing, and I suspect it'll grow like crazy. The success story is here. But again, be wary of the business models in here, because even though Square are processing 15 billion a year and 25 million per day, that's just crazy numbers, the revenues are tiny off that. There's a sliver. And I'll go into how they can, they've really leveraged themselves and said, look, here's our core business from day one, actually. In a conversation with Mr. Dorsey, which was a very privileged introduction, I felt very, very honored to even have, 15 minutes of his time. The vision was always there to use that little white thing, as a Trojan horse. The vision was always to do a merchant solution on one side and have the Square wallet on the other, and this notion of a Square marketplace that they have also finally launched as well. So while everyone was laughing at him saying, your little $5 contraption is kind of rubbish, he's like, yeah, it's fine, it's cool. Laugh at me, please, it's fine. We'll get it out to 2, 3, 4 million merchants. Then all of a sudden we'll open the wallet. Then all of a sudden we'll open the ecosystem. He's basically leveraged that install base to do multiple things. And again, that's how you really get huge value. And if, the more that you sort of talk to venture capitalists, the more you understand they love the term marketplace. And this is exactly what Square have done, which is quite scary. And if you look at some other things that are happening, whether it be Hailo, whether it be Uber, there are marketplace models in there that are way beyond the original idea. And it's the quality of the execution. It determines whether that marketplace will exist and be completely defensible. These guys just deserve one slide. How many people think that Groupon is doing really well right now? Who thinks they're going shit? Okay, so there's more people. You're all wrong. They're going to destroy online commerce in the most ridiculous way. And I only say this because I met with all of them a little while ago. And I was blown away by their last quarter results. So yes, they're down 25% in Europe. Yes, they're down 25% rest of the world. They're up 40-something percent, 46% in America. Why? Their model has almost entirely changed. And again, they've kind of done something and learned from Square here as well, where they've flipped everything on its head. They used to be entirely push. They've got something like 200 million emails in their database. They've got 120 million people who respond and are active. They've got 90 million credit cards on file. They've got something like 80 million people who've actually bought something. Right now, so that traffic was 100% push. Email after email bombarding you like spam. As of last quarter, it's now 40% pull. They've completely changed their app in the States. We can't see it over here yet unless you've got a US account and go check it out over there. They're doing a lot of this personalization now. They're kind of, checking out where you're going, checking out what you're doing, asking you for preferences, figuring out whether you're a guy so you don't get any more laser hair removal kind of ads. Really starting to target stuff not only on a basic level, but on a pretty sophisticated level. And their model going forward is really interesting. And the word that they were throwing around over there was casual commerce. And the one comparison I love is the single biggest complaint that we got from users at Hailo is that we made it too easy to spend a few $100 a month on taxis. It's on your credit card, you don't see it, and at the end of the month you get sticker shock when you get your credit card bill and you're like, really? Did I travel that many times in taxi? That makes us happy. But that's also what's happening to Groupon is they're pushing stuff. They've got your credit card. The price is fantastic. Well, you more or less need it or don't need it. But it's that combined with the massive local element of being able to show you what you need, where, and when that has allowed them, in the matter of a couple of quarters, to increase US business 46%. The next couple of quarters are all about rolling out the same features internationally. I'd be scared to be in the local merchant commerce space because of those guys. They've still got 100 million people to convert to credit cards, and that's without any new advertising. And then, the public figure that they also gave is that now 60% of all transactions and purchases are via mobile. But how do they get to that high level? It's above that. I can't say what number it is, but it was way above that last month. But how are they doing it? Well, they just put in download links in their 200 million email accounts, and people are converting to the app because they want to. So there's a huge drive to kind of move in that direction. So what does it really, really take to get into that kind of billion-dollar club and do something amazing? Build something people need. This is a great Paul Graham quote from Y Combinator. Don't build something clever. Just build what people need and what they want and what they're going to use. Build a fresh product, invent a category. Validate your business model immediately. One of the things that has allowed Hailo to scale so crazily, and in about 2.5 years, just shy of 3 years, we've gone into the hundreds of millions in revenue. We can't say how much precisely. 215 people, 13 active cities, another 50 on the chopping block that we're going to roll out in the next 12 months. It's because we were able to validate that business model very, very quickly. It works, it scales, drivers love the product, passengers love the product. We're capturing revenue, we have good margins. We can always improve the margins, but they're good enough for right now. If you validate in one city, if you validate in one area, if you validate with one group of users, people will give you money to go scale that at a good rate. A huge part of the scaling, and again, you have to do that fast. I've never been part of a company that's grown from 4 or 5 when I was there and joined to 215. It's kind of ridiculous. You're spending a good 15 to 20% of your time in interviews all the time. If you're not, you just won't find the caliber of people. But a huge part of our ability to scale and to grow so quickly has been hiring great people, in fact, over-hiring people when we don't really need them, or when we just think we're about to need them. Because invariably the process takes quite a long time. And if you hire someone great, they're capable of building a team. And that's what we've been able to do as well. But also one thing to remember, and a great example of this, and I'll go into it in a second, is agility in your business model. The business model you have today in mobile may not be the business model that you have in a year or two's time. Take WhatsApp, for example. They completely creamed the premium download, paper download business model early days when they had very little competition. And thank God they did. They got a huge war chest because of it. But they've been forced now to completely adapt. And they've adapted quickly to a recurring $1 model, but free to download. So lean is key. You may laugh at some of these numbers being lean, but compared to turnover, just to understand sort of the teams that are here, WhatsApp, still 40 people, mainly engineers and product guys. Super disciplined in what they build and how. Snapchat, exactly the same thing. Don't go build more features and more stuff if people love what you have. Have the discipline to go and refine that. Flipboard, very, very similar. The rumors around 100, 150 million in revenue these guys are doing off an 800 million valuation. Again, they were just at the point of doing 50 billion page views a month, or some other metric, maybe per week. But a ridiculous amount of page views. It is a channel and a product that people love. Uber's 350 people, rumored to be doing something like 600 million in turnover with a pretty good margin. It's not 600 million in raw revenue, it's in kind of booking numbers. And Hailo, 215, 220 people. Let's not discount some of our friends over in Asia as well. There's a lot to be learnt over there, and I think kind of in Europe and in the US, we tend to discount a lot of that. Pony Ma is an amazing internet entrepreneur. Started Tencent in 1999, 2000, and has grown that to be one of the most formidable beasts in the internet. But, he likes to compliment guys. Basically completely ripped off WhatsApp. Launched it, in January 2011, 300 million users that they have right now. But the interesting, really, part about it is what they actually launched with was one of the features that WhatsApp just launched a few weeks ago, or a few months ago, or about a month or two ago, which is push-to-talk. One of the huge innovations that WeChat had, despite literally cloning the UI, the sections, the layout, everything on the app, was they started with push-to-talk. Why? In Chinese, it's a complete pain to type in the actual language on the keyboard. So push-to-talk, record, send, or push-to-talk and broadcast to someone else. Tiny little feature, massive innovation, completely allowed them to blow up. But the interesting thing is, and Jan Koum, the CEO of WhatsApp, a brilliantly intelligent guy, has only introduced it now to the Western market. He said, it's been something that's really been on his radar for quite a while, but it didn't really fit his main user base. But he's only introduced it right now as he's trying to scale out the big international audience for WhatsApp. The other one that's quite interesting, Japan used to be a superpower, number 2 after the States. But what have they done in the internet, recently? Line is a really interesting example that corporates can follow in terms of product management and product development. This was effectively started by a big corporate and a bunch of engineers as a communication system for early warning for earthquakes. Or so the story goes. It's also another WhatsApp clone in sort of another disguise, but with a quite different strategy. But in 2 years, for a corporate startup to go to 240 million users, and those are active, and 80% are outside Japan, this is like a proper product with real revenues. These guys are like 200 million run rate, 250 million run rate. That's pretty phenomenal. We can start learning from these guys. Where's the corporate that's doing this in Europe or in Russia? I would really like to see that happen. It's completely and utterly possible now. But the really interesting difference between what Line is doing and what WhatsApp is doing is, they've got the resources, they've got the engineers. They've built the most fully featured app you can ever imagine. It's got stores, it's got stickers, it's got push-to-talk. It's also got free talk to between the apps, so very much like Skype and a free VoIP client. It's gone down every single route. It wants to be everything to everyone. And interestingly, where they're seeing their growth, which is very targeted in Thailand, in the Middle East, it's working like crazy. And these guys are starting to go up there. If they start going to 300-400 million user range, we're talking about challenging some of the biggest companies in the world in terms of these communication systems. If they could ever break into Western Europe and the US, that's pretty scary for some of the big guys out there. So I really wanted to kind of end on one really kind of interesting area and to kind of really frame what makes an opportunity super interesting. When we started Hailo, we went after a market that needed complete disruption. Taxis had been doing absolutely nothing novel for years, and the market was absolutely enormous. There are 25 cities in the world that gross more than £1 billion a year in taxi fares. There's another interesting market that unfortunately doesn't apply to a huge amount of users, but that from a product perspective is actually fascinating because we've got a smaller addressable market and a really kind of interesting area. And that's private aviation. Private aviation and private jets are worth about $27 billion a year, about 6-7 of that just in Western Europe alone. The rest is kind of distributed between Russia, Asia, and the US. And I'm really excited about developing new products, but developing products for me is about going in there and not just making the app and doing the user interface. It's what's the model that we need to introduce here? What's the real opportunity? How do we actually create the marketplace? How do we ensure that there's supply there? How do we put all these components together? Because product thinking is not just about the end point. To me, it's the end to end. Jay Bregman, the CEO of Hailo, brought me on board and gave me the opportunity to be part of Hailo because I sat down and said, look, some of these things really work, some of them don't, but we need to think about this holistically in terms of a marketplace, how it's going to be international from day one and have $1 billion vision from day one. And when I met Clive Jackson, the CEO of Victor, he also had that $1 billion vision of how do we make it so much easier to actually book a private jet, whether it be a charter, whether it be an empty seat. It's a massively inefficient market. It's a massively fascinating market as well, and it's very hard to break into. There are lots of hurdles to actually break into that kind of market. So Victor has been bootstrapping for a while, just closed a nice big round. They've got hundreds of different aircraft operators that they work with all around Europe, mainly. They've already booked thousands of flights, but they've had 1.5 tech people, really supporting this whole system for, about the last 1.5 to 2 years. And for those who are interested, blatant plug, I'm going to work for them to help them with the product. If anyone here is interested in talking to me about that, we'd absolutely love to hear from you. But this will be a $1 billion app. This will be a $1 billion business, and quicker than we can even absolutely imagine. So the last thought I really want to kind of leave everyone with is, yeah, $1 billion sounds crazy. I thought $1 billion valuation for an app and for a company before Hailo. I'm just like you guys. Started off in product management, worked my way up through a bunch of stuff, worked through and really kept my eye on opportunities. There's some opportunities out there. You have to run after the opportunities, but keep the dream alive. Try and make that $1 billion app. I'm sure we can.